Hello, everybody. Welcome to the State of Hearing Therapeutics, Opportunities and Challenges. Today, we have assembled a panel of experts on the topic of hearing therapeutics in 2025, where we are and what's next. I'm your host, Brian Taylor. And with me today, I have a panel of experts on the field of hearing therapeutics. And we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. And I'm going to have each of our panelists go around and introduce themselves, talk about their company and what they're involved in. So I'm going to start with Douglas Hartley.
Thank you. I'm Doug Hartley. I'm a professor of otology. I'm a cochlear implant surgeon in Nottingham. I'm also I lead the objective measures group in the University of Nottingham, and I'm also the chief medical officer of Rinri Therapeutics, who are pioneering a cell therapeutic for hearing loss.
Excellent. Hugo, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for having me today. I think my most relevant credential, especially compared to all the experts here, is that I've been working on spiral therapeutics for the last 8 years or so. I have a background in otology, but on the commercial side, my background is in business. And yeah, so at Spiral Therapeutics, we're developing therapeutics for the treatment of the inner ear, especially balance disorders and hearing loss. On the balance side, we are working on a treatment for Meniere's disease, and we're actually just out of phase 2 where we collected successful data. So we're continuing to advance this program, and we're also advancing a pipeline of different small molecules and small peptides for other inner ear disorders.
Excellent. Jonas?
My name is Jonas Dyhrfjeld-Johnsen. I'm the Chief Development Officer and Managing Director of Acousia Therapeutics in Tübingen, Germany, down in the south. We are a small biotech focused strictly on hearing. We are developing Kv7.4 potassium channel activators broadly to treat either by enhancing outer hair cell function or preserving outer hair cell function. We currently have our lead program in Aku85 in phase 2 development as a candidate for preventing ototoxicity induced by cisplatin. A long time ago, my background was in biophysics and neuroscience, but I've spent the last 15 years in inner ear drug development and hoping to continue doing that for a while.
Excellent. Jian?
Hi, my name is Jian Zuo. I'm currently the co-founder and CEO of Ting Therapeutics, a small startup company focusing on developing small molecules for cisplatin-induced hearing loss. And we have developed multiple preclinical drug candidates that would be suitable for preventing the cisplatin-induced hearing loss. And before that, I have been a professor for 25 years. Developing, studying the mechanism as well as the therapeutics for hearing loss.
Excellent. And finally, we have Tony.
Hi, I'm Tony Ricci. I'm a professor at Stanford University. I'm part of a team that's studying hearing loss called the Stanford Initiative to Cure Hearing Loss. My background is cell physiology and neuroscience, biophysics. I also work on drug delivery and surgical approaches and ototoxicity, things like that.
Excellent. I think since many of our viewers may be unfamiliar with the term hearing therapeutics, and since I introduced you last, Tony, if you could take a crack at defining for our viewers who are mainly hearing care professionals, how would you define a hearing therapeutic?
Well, I think the idea is that hearing loss can be treated in a variety of ways. So there's traditional hearing aids and cochlear implants, so kind of hardware device design. There's also small molecules or chemical therapeutics, so drugs. Then there's also, we're moving into, targeted gene therapy approaches. So I think it would be really pretty broad. I personally would also add diagnostic tools for early detection of hearing loss. And finally, I guess what I've said so far really focuses on the periphery, but there's a lot of central processing issues that happen with peripheral hearing loss. And so I would extend therapeutics to deal with cognitive function that's impacted with hearing loss as well.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us. We really appreciate it. And I think to make this kind of flow smoothly, we have some talking points and some topics that we want to address. And rather than just wait for all of you to chime in, I think to get the ball rolling, if you don't mind, I'll just kind of introduce the topic, and then I'll call on a couple of you to expound on what that topic might be. So the first one is the current landscape around hearing therapeutics. What are some of the promising developments in gene therapy, cell therapy, drug delivery? Can you talk a little bit about that? And I'll start with Doug.
Yeah, thanks. So look, I mean, there's a lot of development in this field. I mean, gene therapies, you know, have made huge advances in sort of targeted approaches, like gene replacement or editing, and, you know, really opening up opportunities for specific forms of genetic hearing loss, obviously demonstrated recently by the otoferlin trials, and a number of companies have been aiming towards that as a sort of first in human target, and certainly have gained some very promising results there. But obviously these offer curative potential, at least in an early stage of the disease, in relatively, you know, small groups of well-defined individuals. In terms of cell therapies, companies like Rinri Therapeutics are definitely pioneering that field by exploring, you know, regeneration of both neural pathways, but also the sensory hair cells. And, you know, that it has the potential to, you know, leap us forward in biological restoration of hearing. The first in human trial for Rinri Therapeutics is due to commence later on this year. And, you know, I think such therapies could really restore function where current devices like cochlear implants really fall short, including addressing that neural hearing loss, a condition that doesn't currently have any treatment whatsoever. And unlike other approaches, I think cell therapies can be effective regardless of the underlying pathology, and potentially at a later stage of the pathology. In terms of metabolic approaches, you know, there have been many trials conducted, and current trials, you know, are looking towards protecting or restoring cochlear function through biochemical pathways. Key examples include Autonomy's trial for OTO 413, targeting synaptic repair, and other drugs like Pipeline Therapeutics, for example, with synaptopathy repairs. So look, these treatments can rely on enhancing connections, you know, but rather than necessarily directly addressing the genetic or defects or the regeneration of cells. But, you know, with promising effects, you know, targeting conditions like noise-induced hearing loss and age-related decline, there are kind of challenges with any of these approaches, including, you know, targeting the specific pathways and demonstrating sustained benefit, and also, you know, delivering those drugs to the right location. But, you know, there's a huge amount of promising work in this field.
Hugo, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think what Doug shares is obviously accurate. I think important aspect from my perspective is that we have no treatments available, maybe with the exception of PETMARK, which is the drug that Fennec brought to market for systemic treatment of chemotherapy-induced hearing loss in pediatric patients. Other than that, there's been little success in clinical translation in our field. And that's in contrast with the very promising preclinical data that I believe the field has been able to collect over the last few decades. Part of it is work that Harvard and even Stanford, led by Tony and some of his colleagues, have done over the years. But this lack of clinical translation is something that we've looked at very hard, and where we came to the conclusion that drug delivery might be an aspect that will help address that challenge. We think that getting drugs into the inner ear for the right duration and at the right place, right? That's going to be really important. And that's really going to help us bring drugs to market for a range of diseases that are just going to be very important. And when I look at the field of ophthalmology, for example, where pathophysiology and mechanisms and everything is very, very similar with the ear, with the exception that location and access are much different and much more complicated on the ear side. I think there's a lot of inspiration for us to take from that field. And even when we think about those drugs or mechanisms that have been successful in ophthalmology, the idea of being able to identify right patient population, right duration of delivery, and making sure that the drug gets there, that should really help us address underlying disease and some of the conditions that these patients are suffering that they have no treatment for. So from that perspective, and especially at Spiral, we're extremely committed to that aspect of drug delivery. I think the field is starting to recognize that largely. The gene therapies obviously helped because those are therapies that require placement. So that was a first step. I think it's really nice to see what Rinri is doing also for their gene cell therapy delivery. But I think also other players with small molecules and intratympanic injections are also starting to recognize that that's going to be a significant aspect of future success for the field. And I think to Tony's point about diagnostic, I think in a field with no drugs approved, everything is held back, right? So as we keep thinking about maybe having treatments that will start showing promise in late stage trials, eventually commercially, that's really going to accelerate the way that we understand disease, the way that we have an incentive to bring patients in, diagnose them, and make sure that it's not only just that we know what's happening with them, it's also that we have a solution to what's happening. And today, hearing aids, cochlear implants, obviously remarkable progress that has been made. And when we think about being able to implement machine learning and some of those aspects, that's really going to help improve audiology and maybe understand better different subsets of patient population, especially across hearing loss. But yeah, I mean, in the end, we might not be in a position where we have to look for rocket science to really change the field. We just need to be smart in the ways that we get drugs there, and in the ways that we select those patients that are going to respond to those treatments. So that's the way I see the future of the field and where we are today.
Thank you for that, Hugo. Let's expand on this current topic and talk a little bit about some of the recent successes, a little bit about some clinical trials and other areas in that around some of these successes. So Jian, could you kind of share with us some of your insights, findings around clinical trials?
I may not be the best person to outline some of the recent successes. I think the recent gathering of all those industry leaders in the JPM meeting just last week, right? Led by Hugo and Jonas may have better outlines of all those recent successes. But according to my knowledge, there are quite a few successful examples, not only in the otofurling gene therapy field, like outlined by both Doc and others. There are also very exciting studies of outcomes from Spiral Hugo's group, and also from Jonas and Kill and Sun Pharmaceutical companies' clinical trials. I know that the Jonas and Kill's the Epsilon has very good success in treatment of Meniere's disease in the phase 3 clinical trials, as well as some of the sudden hearing loss, as well as noise-induced hearing loss clinical trials. I think this is really a very exciting development. And I think Hugo can go a little bit more about their success in the phase 2 clinical trials for deliveries.
Okay.
I think that's the two very exciting developments. And then I think Jonas has also had some ongoing phase 2 clinical trials, and we're looking forward to those successes in the future. I think there are also a few other recent developments that are very exciting. For example, they outlined the auto-fulfilling clinical trials, and they have been awarded to the ARO clinical trial recipients this year. I think it was very exciting. Also published a few papers in about the restoration of hearing for those genetic diseases with auto-fulfilling. I think it's very exciting. I think that those are the few items that I had in mind. Maybe some other panelists can add
Yes.
more.
Well, you mentioned Jonas and Hugo, so let's go to Jonas. We haven't heard from you yet. So how could you expound on this topic?
Well, maybe just to be slightly provocative to begin with, I'm not sure that we necessarily have a massively different challenge to getting drugs to the inner ear than in so many other fields. I think to a large extent it depends on your candidate. I mean, PETMARK is systemically delivered, reaches the inner ear. JC just mentioned Jonathan Keel's work with Epsilon, systemically delivered, reaches the inner ear. Other drug candidates are not adapted or appropriate for systemic delivery, be that gene therapies or molecules that don't necessarily diffuse well across the broad labyrinth barrier. But certainly the ophthalmologists have an advantage. The eye is readily accessible. You can fairly easily do an injection directly, or even topical eye drops, something like that. On the other hand, CNS drugs, we typically deliver systemically as tablets, as pills. They're also behind the blood-brain barrier inside a decently strong bone like the temporal bone. So I think it comes down to maybe getting a little bit away from trying to go too fast with repositioning of existing candidates and trying to sort of survive the pressure of delivering fast, which we're all sort of suffering under to some extent, as long as there's very few successes or candidates that have made it all the way to market in the field. There's always going to be a lot of uncertainty. There's going to be a lot of assumed risk in this field. So everybody has to deliver as fast as possible, right? But classically speaking, if you're doing CNS drug development, one of the first steps you'll take all the way back to medicinal chemistry and selecting your not even your lead candidate, but your potential leads, right? What's starting to narrow down your hits is distribution study, ADME work to see if there's a likelihood of your candidate getting to the ear. So if you have a target and multiple potential candidates hitting that target, well, you better pick the right one to begin with, instead of putting all your eggs in one basket and hoping you can find a way to deliver something that maybe has other advantages, such as an existing tox package or a phase 1 study that has been passed successfully. So I think on one hand we're special. On the other hand, there's a lot of learnings to be taken from many other fields, and simply say we have to apply best practices and not necessarily simply try to go as fast or as low cost as possible, because it's hard to get funding, because there's a pressure to deliver, because investors are looking to see fast results because they don't have a lot of reference saying that this can be done, right? On the other hand, I think there are other things we can also still do better, and it's starting to happen. For example, doing extended high frequency audiometry. It reveals a lot of things that are considered hidden. I tend to get in interesting discussions with people about hidden hearing loss who've done PTA up to 8 kilohertz, and then considers that the patient has a communication issue on understanding speech and noise problem, so it must be hidden hearing loss. Couldn't it just be extended high frequency audiometry? We have recent, very interesting data both from previous clinical trials. We see it ourselves in our ongoing phase 2 trial, that once you go up to 16, 18 kilohertz, all of a sudden things like cisplatin ototoxicity in adults becomes a problem for 80% of the patients, not for 30, as it was assumed in the literature some 10 years ago. And we're not talking sort of mild impact, right? We're talking 40 dB and up. So again, do we need to develop new measures, or do we simply need to apply state of the art of the current measures? It's probably not one or the other, but probably more a little bit of both. I'm personally very encouraged by at least one drug having made it to market, one drug that's systemically delivered, one drug that at least answers a number of questions. It shows it's possible. Of course, it's a smaller indication. It comes with a lot of caveats in terms of potential drug-drug interaction, impact on chemotherapy survival, etc. But it sort of sets a stake in the ground saying this is doable, right? And for some candidates, we're going to need special delivery from techniques or approaches or formulations. For others, it doesn't seem to be such a big deal. So we need to do the hard work, the systematic work, to really enable as many of these promising therapies to make it all the way.
Right. Okay. Well, let me let's hear from let's take another minute or so. Jay-Z mentioned Hugo, that he would maybe have some insights onto this around clinical trials. So Hugo, very briefly, if you could chime in about this.
Before I go, Ben, since I already spoke, I saw Tony maybe wanted to raise his hand and add some thoughts to what Jonas was discussing, which I thought, Jonas, for sure, really appreciate your counterpoint about, like drug delivery is a problem, but maybe not so big since they're all drugs that have worked. But Tony, I think it'd be great to hear from you as well.
Okay, let's hear from Tony then.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I guess in terms of drug delivery, I think that both answers are correct. I think there are places where systemic approaches are going to be useful, and we just need to take the time to figure it out. But I also think that if we want to move into gene therapy or regenerative approaches and things like that, that's going to have to be a local delivery, and understanding the blood labyrinth barrier, the connection between the ear and the brain fluid-wise, I think is where we need to be if we really want to get into biological solutions. I also thought the comments around diagnostics and measuring high-frequency hearing loss is really critical, because I think standard of care right now is not what it should be, and it's not a matter of needing new technology. We do better testing on mice than is typically done in the clinic, and that's nothing to do with audiologists or anything like that. It just has to do with the healthcare system and what's considered the appropriate testing right now. I mean, with aminoglycosides, we know that there's a much higher loss, hearing loss, than has been published, as has already been mentioned. The same is true with cisplatin. What hidden hearing loss is may, in fact, simply be how the diagnostic tools are done and not the underlying biological question. I mean, people are not studying in mice where hidden hearing loss was, kind of described. Doing high-frequency hearing testing in mice hasn't really been done very well either, even though it can. It's just a little trickier. So I do think that, making that the technologies are here for us to apply in a more clever way. The tools are here, which is why it's such an exciting time to be in the field. It's just working around the specific questions that we need to get at and catching up with other fields and applying technologies and the knowledge that's there into the COVID.
Thank you for that, Tony. Does anyone else want to talk about other barriers to progress? I know that there must be some regulatory hurdles that all of you face, given the complexities of the research and the interventions here. Doug or JZ, do you want to go ahead and expand on that?
Before I get on to any sort of regulator, I mean, I think drug delivery, a lot of very pertinent points have been brought up around the challenges there. I think, direct delivery is, definitely the key for gene and cell-based approaches. I mean, there is as a cochlear implant surgeon, I regularly approach the inner ear, and there is a role for adjunctive therapies, and certainly Rinri's first in human trial is as an adjunct to cochlear implantation, for example. So whilst we have to not only approach the inner ear, but also approach the internal auditory meatus, so really going, entering a CSF containing space to deliver the otic neuroprogenitor cells, Rin cell 1, there is a lot that we can do in order to piggyback on existing surgical approaches, and in order to deliver those cells and therapy safely and effectively. Diagnostics are absolutely a key area that we're failing, I think, to pinpoint specific pathologies, amongst them auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, for example, and really leaving some patient groups underrepresented or untreated. And whilst a lot of the outcome measures we've got for early phase trials definitely can focus on safety and peripheral efficacy, for later phase trials we don't really have the right real world outcome measures that are appropriate and often not fit for service. So you have purpose, but patient-reported outcome measures and a lot of the speech comprehension and quality of life measures are not really appropriate for our field. Conducting trials in our field are challenging, not only for the specific unique challenges of hearing, or the associated with hearing patients. There are the extremes of ages. They have obviously communication issues, comorbidities, but also the field is not as familiar with clinical trials as some other fields are, and indeed the professionals, whilst audiologists, ENT specialists are well versed in hearing devices, hearing aids, and not necessarily so versed in drug-based or advanced therapy. So lots of gaps there for adoption, and likewise the regulators aren't quite so familiar as well. So coming on to your your question, we have to meet with regulators at very early stages of our trial designs to ensure that they are kind of on board with our whole trajectory. And there are kind of very specific challenges in certain territories, for example combining novel treatments and drug delivery devices. Might be okay in one territory, but certainly not in another. And in our own in the UK, for example, that combination has led to some cell-based therapy trials being conducted, although they're being run and funded in the UK, they've been conducted in other territories. So lots of challenges and hurdles. But I think with the successes of some recent trials, a lot of those hurdles, particularly with the regulators lacking clear understanding of the field and the unique challenges distinguishing between device-based solutions and emerging biological therapies, I think we are in the foothills of overcoming some of those challenges.
Before we leave this topic of barriers to progress, I was wondering if maybe Jonas, I'll call on you, if you could talk about some funding gaps with respect to securing resources to conduct these studies.
Sure. maybe just to go back to the delivery for a brief minute. I'm neither pro or con either. I think it's the right tool for the right job and for the right patient population. And in fact, we do deliver therapeutics for different populations and the same target, but different molecules with both systemic and local administration. So no religion on my side, but pick the right one for what you're trying to do. Funding gaps is certainly, I mean, I think all of us in the field have seen that the last couple of years have been challenging in terms of funding in general. That's not specific to hearing therapeutics. That's a general struggle for all biotech companies, but certainly it doesn't make it easier when you're in a field with a lot of unknowns. And it has helped a little bit to, as I said, to get the first drug approved and marketed, both in the US, now also in Europe, and a positive opinion from the UK's NICE commission on PET C, as it's being called in Europe, as opposed to PET in the US. That helps, but it's one example, right? And I think the challenge for all of us is to keep generating good data, generate successful step-by-step clinical trial outcomes. You will probably be expecting that almost everybody will say, well, come back when you have proof of concept in clinic, phase 2 data, at least the phase 2A study. Of course, living up to all the other standards that's expected in the field, but the challenge is still, it's a young field. People are not familiar with the challenges, like Doug mentioned. Regulatory is not necessarily educated on the challenges too, but neither are VCs. And the typical reaction from VCs to all these unknowns is to say, well, we'll let somebody else take that risk and come back and see us when you have some proof, right? So the more success we can collectively generate, the more de-risking the whole field will take. And of course, people are still looking at what still remains fairly recent phase 3 or late phase 2B trial failures, right? So we have to generate the evidence to the opposite, that this is actually feasible, that we can do it in a rigorous fashion, that we can overcome the not lack of enthusiasm on the clinical trial sites, but the lack of experience, and make sure we build everything so robustly that what we deliver will be considered good evidence, will be considered solid, and generate that rising tide to lift all the boats.
JZ, I see that you want to weigh in on this.
Yeah, so maybe in addition, this is in the topic of barriers to progress. I want to point out a few more points that had not been mentioned yet. In terms of gene therapy, despite the great progress in the recent years, and I still feel there's a strong biological limitation for gene therapy for congenital deafness. In particular, at the time of the gene therapy and the mutation-induced biological damage. I think this is the key problem for gene therapy that we'll be facing in the future. The perfect two examples are VGLU3 and otoferlin, which are both involved in the similar biological event. However, VGLU3 cannot be really gene corrected by later stages of life, especially when the baby was born. So those are key representative problems for our gene therapy field. And I hope that this can be resolved, not technical problem, but more about biological limitations. And then I also want to mention that in the noise-induced hearing loss, for example, during the clinical trials, there are a lot of successes, or not success, a lot of trials, about 30 or so registered. However, none of them are approved and they're not successful. There are a large number of problems that are facing this noise-induced hearing loss field. One of them is that has not been mentioned yet, is that it's illegal to have noise-induced hearing loss as a profession in any developing or developed countries. In the United States, for example, you cannot have noise-induced hearing loss occur during your during work hours and so on. So the military settings, as well as construction workers in the airport and so on, is not supposed to have hearing loss, induced hearing loss. So these represent a significant legal challenge for any of these clinical trials to move forward. And then the second is that thanks to the mentioned about the diagnostic things. And diagnostic not only can provide some of the populations that can be enhanced for the clinical trials, but also it has a significant drawback. The more you diagnose those people who are susceptible for hearing loss, the less clinical population you're going to get in the future. So these represents another significant challenge, I think. And then finally, I would like to mention about the regulatory challenges, as everybody's mentioned. It's a very challenging, for example, in terms of VCs, they, as Jonas just mentioned, they need to be educated for many of the things that we just mentioned. There's intrinsic risks that we don't have control on. But this is the nature. For example, many of the VCs that they just don't like to invest in the hearing field, not only because of the many recent failures in clinical trials, but also there's significant, I don't know, is a bias or risk associated with it, just for the fact that their ophthalmology represent investment in this VC field, represent pretty high ranking, investment in their portfolios, while the audiology is not even on the list on all the percentage, besides all of the, the cancer immunology and all the stuff and the cardiovascular, but, otology in all the VC field is almost minimal. It did not even make the list on top 20 or 30 in the investment field. It's really difficult in that way.
If I may, I think that's also driven by the fact that with the very few, or just Fennec's PET mark being approved, and that being in the early days of commercial stages, it's very difficult to establish the size of the market. And I think we can be convinced that there's large numbers of patients suffering from hearing loss. We also know that obviously hearing aids are a solution for them, but we don't know exactly how they're going. The market is going to react to there being treatments for hearing loss. There are other indications within the inner ear with more acute symptoms that where the expectation for market size might be better, easier to approach. But when you think about broader hearing loss unmet needs, it's hard to really estimate, willingness to pay, size of the market. And I think that also drives a little bit of the hesitation from the venture capitalists, where they have to make decisions based on return on investment, not just their passion for science, which is obviously what we're all here for. But there are all these other commercial considerations, right? So.
Well, let me ask the panelists that haven't weighed in on this. How do you look at this? What's the market size? What's the prospects for commercialization of the therapeutics that you're trying to bring to market? I'd like to hear from each of you on that, if you could briefly.
I think for those of us, doing the work, we're going to tell you that this is huge. This is a huge unmet need, and there's so much opportunity, just even beyond the current programs that we have ongoing. There's, the way I see it, two main aspects that happen in the eye that, again, looking at ophthalmology as well, which is a multi-billion-dollar market. Inflammation and neurodegeneration are probably the two largest aspects for peripheral unmet needs. Then so obviously the CNS aspect that we might also want to get to at some point. It is also being something that could represent a huge market. Sometimes we joke that if you had a treatment that could reduce or slow down hearing loss by 50%, and that was a once a year treatment. If you think about what anti-VEGFs have done in the eye, those could be like multi-billion-dollar markets, even to the point of reaching size of the current GLP-1s. But then again, there's a willingness to pay. There's the how hearing loss is perceived also from a societal standpoint, where I think people are more willing to just walk around with poor hearing than they are to walk around with poor sight, right? So those are also part of the education and again availability of treatment, right? If you have nothing that is practical to use, that is friendly, patient friendly, it's just going to be really hard to establish how big that could become. But I think we can be confident that if we can address inflammation of the ear, if we can address neurodegeneration of the ear, that's going to lead to a very significant opportunity also on the commercial side.
I think it's an interesting point from you, Hugo, that I think we can all agree that it's a massive market. I think we just have to look at the patient numbers, right? I usually joke with people to say that if they missed out on GLP-1, there's twice as many people with hearing loss. So inherently, it's potentially a massive market. So that should interest the BCs. But conversely, I think we also have a similar challenge as to another young and growing field in terms of longevity therapeutics, that you also have to come up with something segmented, concrete, realistic. Because if you're just going to say, well, we're going to treat everybody with age-related hearing loss and you're going to make more money than Elon Musk, that's a sort of pie in the sky dream that's not very concrete for the VCs as well. So how can you segment things down to something that is attractive but still palatable and doesn't seem too unrealistic? And we've looked at cisplatin alone as a standalone market that easily gets into the billion-dollar peak sales. Looking at something like age-related hearing loss, you have to come up with maybe a little bit more realistic approach and say, we're not just going to put this in the drinking water and treat everybody. And of course, speaking from a small molecule perspective, it wouldn't work with the gene therapy, but how can you sort of come up with something that is fairly realistic, patients that are addressable, that already have contact with an ENT physician, where a potential big pharma doesn't have to go out and build a sales channel, find the patients, run a lot of marketing campaigns? How can you sort of come up with a well-defined subset of patients that you can start with, in the same way as I think longevity therapeutics are often struggling with coming up with something realistic and say, we're going to make everybody live forever versus we're going to give people another 10, 20 good years where they don't suffer a lot of the morbidities of aging. So I think that's really where the commercial modeling strategy pitch has to be really worked on well, to say, how do you make this feasible while still keeping it attractive?
Okay, thank you for that. Let's, in the interest of time, let's move to your take on visions for the future. I'm curious to know from each of you, how do you see the field progressing over the next decade? What are some things that are needed to accelerate progress? And if we could start with Tony and then move to Doug, that would be great.
I guess optimistically, I think the big thing that hopefully will happen over the next 5 to 10 years is the recognition by the general public how hearing loss impacts their life, and in fact, I would say their brain function. And so, do you want to live to 90 if you can't communicate with the people around you, and if your cognitive function is declined to the point where you don't know that you're living to be 90? And that's going to take, early intervention and attention to hearing. I think, and I think identifying therapeutic windows is really going to be key for a lot of this. I think it was kind of alluded to with the gene therapy side of this, that, are we going to be doing in utero gene therapy to deal with some early, genetic losses, or what are the targets that we can actually get at later? So I think that And I think those are solvable if people just kind of take them on head first. Well, to me, as a basic scientist, I mean, what we need is a workforce that's larger. We need people who think differently, that see solving the problems of hearing loss as actually doable. I think that's why people don't go to doctors. I mean, because they know there's not much treatment. They look at their grandparents and they don't wear their hearing aids, and so why should they? And it just kind of trickles down. And so getting people to really see it from the population side, and getting young scientists more excited about the potential of the field, right? So for me, if you wanted, most of the techniques that I use, you could, electrophysiology and imaging and things like that, you can do, in the brain, and it's way easier to do. And so if you're interested in the techniques, that's where you're going to go. And it's sexy to think about working on dementia and Alzheimer's disease and things like that, where, taking those tools and doing it in the cochlea or in the vestibular system is just a lot harder, right? And so why would you do it? Because what are you going to do next in life, right? Now at least you guys are at least, pushing where there are some companies available. There's some interest in trying to do translational work, but it's really hard to get scientists, especially the junior scientists, to see, kind of have a long view that this is a place to work, right? And they see, me as the old guy doing research in the ear. It's hard, right? There's not a lot of funding available at the basic science level, at the translational level, and there's not been a lot of success with it either. Like a simple example, right? So you can do semicircular canal drug delivery in a mouse, and it's definitely better than round window or other approaches. So if you're studying something like gene therapy, say, you use semicircular canal, and then, well, now what do you do? So who's going to pay for you to develop the drug delivery method, not in a mouse, as a basic scientist? Because the university is not going to give you animal space for whatever the model animal is, and then NIH isn't going to really want to fund that kind of narrow band question, even though it is a roadblock. So I think it's going to take more partnerships between academics and companies and whatnot to really. I mean, I feel like we've been doing a lot of griping, but I mean, the field is really, it's just waiting, right? I mean, I think everything is there, and it's just having enough people with the resolve to get the work done, and the recognition that it's work that needs to be done.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Tony. No, let's move to Doug. We haven't heard from Doug in a while. What's your take on
this? I would take everything that Tony says. I would say, look, my vision is that we will be seeing a very significant increase, I hope, in both early and late phase trials within the field, and the first market authorized therapies emerging within that, decade, hopefully. We're going to need, not only Tony mentioned, that collaboration between academics and industry, but also with the clinicians involved as well. Obviously patients and public need to be brought on board here too, and helping direct those treatments. I think we definitely need improved diagnostics and outcome measures that are really better aligned with real world needs. And the field desperately needs, funding and regulatory bodies that are more familiar with and supportive of advanced therapy. But I think with that enhancement in knowledge and trial methodology, I think, a cultural change could occur to address a lot of the fears and misconceptions amongst professionals, patients and investors about advanced therapies in our field. And ultimately what we need is success stories. We need success stories in early and late phase trials to really boost confidence in the field.
Excellent. Jay-Z.
Yeah, I just want to echo one sentence. We need some successes in the field.
Okay, thank you. Hugo?
I think that's right. And I think it all comes together to, once we have one success, everything else is going to accelerate. So the better diagnostics, the better understanding of the VCs, of the opportunities, so everything gets funded better. Researchers also get excited because they see that there are things that actually are getting to patients instead of just being stuck in that, animal study phase. I think all of that is right. And the perspective that I've personally taken at Spiral, and the team obviously follows, is and back to what I said early on, maybe this is not a matter of, and of course, different disease requires different treatments, and novel mechanisms and new chemical entities are going to be very important, and also recognized by the investors as an opportunity to focus, and because of that IP protection. But in the end, just simple solutions that can get us to success and very, clear improvement of how we manage those patients are already going to be very important. And, particular at Spiral, our lead candidate is a steroid. It's dexamethasone. And, while that doesn't sound very sexy, we think that that's very important. Every field of medicine has a steroid that is approved, and that is necessary not only for primary treatment of different disease, but also as an adjuvant for different things. And having the ability to deliver a steroid durably, conveniently to a patient to affect the disease, we think that that's going to be a significant change for the market. Hopefully that will be a part of us contributing to that field, getting more exciting, and the understanding of, okay, there are things that can work. So now let's keep investing in novel mechanisms and more differentiated things, which we also have in the pipeline. And we recognize that, Acousia has, and Rinri, and JC also working on those things. Of course, the field is it's very exciting right now, but we didn't need to get there. We need to get to that breakthrough so that people, everything, the whole community starts understanding that, even the clinicians, like Tony said, understand that there are other solutions that we can recommend to the patients, that we can say, okay, it's not just a surgery. It's not just, here's a hearing aid that might patch the problem, but not really resolve it. Here, we're really working on addressing the underlying issue, and it might start with very basic things that help build the foundation for the field to then start getting excited about other more innovative solutions.
Thank you, Hugo. And Jonas, we don't want to forget you.
I think anything that works is sexy, so I don't think you have to worry about dexamethasone if you can show the good results, Hugo. I think it's an overall ecosystem that needs the success. I think if, of course, the onus right now on more success stories that will bring investments is on the level of the industry, but success on the industry level will bring interesting therapeutic options to the clinicians. It'll also hopefully help retain some of the young, smart people that Tony is mentioning in the hearing research, because there could be collaborations, there could be funding, there could be increased awareness around the field, right? So to bring it forward, it's not just one part of the ecosystem, but every part of the ecosystem has the possibility to positively affect each other as well. So the more collaboration and the more focus we can bring on hearing as a disease, as a therapeutic area, the better it'll be for everybody, not just in the ecosystem, but eventually also the biggest, most important perhaps part of the ecosystem, namely the patients that can get better treatment opportunities.
Well, I know we're over our time, but if you're able to stay on, I would love for each of you to chime in, weigh in on what is one thing that you would want clinicians, hearing care professionals, people with hearing loss, what's one thing that we maybe haven't talked about yet, or one thing that you want to elaborate on? If you could each be, keep your response to a minute or two, that'd be great. I'll let you weigh in as you'd like.
Maybe to go back to what we talked about earlier on, and what Tony emphasized as well, that do the maximum possible with what you already have. Don't wait for necessarily for new things to be invented or developed. I think we can do a lot if we simply would, generally speaking, do the extended high frequency audiometry to really understand what's happening on each patient. That could help us segment, that could help the patients perhaps get a validation of what they're experiencing, but that doesn't seem to correlate with their current audiograms. And it could help us understand where to go with candidates. So use the existing technology to the fullest while we work on additional solutions.
Excellent. Others?
Maybe I can jump in. I think the one thing I would like the clinicians and the patients to do is to stand up to influence the policymakers and VCs and many others that this hearing loss is important and has a huge market and it's profitable and is going to get return, is going to affect a significant number of people. So I think that is the attitude that I think we all should work on, and particularly the doctors as well as patients.
Thank you. Tony, Hugo, Doug?
Yeah, I'll put my chime in for let's move beyond the audiogram in order to diagnose hearing loss. Degree of hearing loss is a factor, but let's become specific about what the cause of the hearing loss is in order to direct some of these patients to appropriate and emerging therapies, that move beyond the hearing aid and the cochlear implant that can really restore hearing and natural hearing for these individuals.
Tony, Hugo, do you have anything?
I'll echo a little bit of what's been said. I think I do think diagnostics has to be applied better. Word recognition types of tests, things like that, more not simply audiograms. I think assessing high frequency is similar to assessing, speech and noise types of tests need to be used for early identification of hearing loss. And I think, to me, clinicians are really in the most powerful position to change culture, to impact patients and to impact funding agencies around the need for the diagnostics, but also that how hearing loss impacts so many aspects of life that we really need to hit that and get awareness that, that there, if there aren't exactly tools ready now, that tools will be there, but that only happens with first recognizing that there's a problem.
Thank you. And finally, I don't think, Hugo, we've heard from you on this last final thought.
On this last one, I think I really don't want to be too redundant. I think everything has been addressed. I think ultimately it's our obligation to also, or our mission to just give the clinicians the tools to keep innovating and helping us think about what are the solutions going to be in the future. So I think we can ask a lot from them, but in the end, we also need to guide where things are going, and we need to just be proactive there.
Well, I can't thank all of you enough for the engaging discussion, the shared insights. It's not often that you get such an esteemed group of experts together to talk about an important topic like therapeutics. Thank you all very much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.